Welcome to the presidential-sponsored session, History on Fire, a 25th anniversary roundtable for Scenes of Subjection, honoring Saidiya Hartman's field-defining book and its recent republication. I am Marisa Fuentes, and I teach at Rutgers University, and I will be chairing this panel. Sarah Haley from Columbia took the lead in organizing this panel, and she will serve as a moderator. Sarah will start us off by reading two short selections from scenes, and our presenters will speak in the order listed on the program. And to save time and give the panelists ample room to speak, we will forego the traditional long introductions, and I'll just provide name and affiliation before each person speaks, but I will project their bios on the screen. Hopefully that will work. Each person will speak for about 8 minutes, and I will turn it over to Sarah. Thanks for coming.
Uh-oh. Hello, can you hear me? Okay. I'll just try and project. Can you hear me in the back at all? Yeah? Okay, thanks. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm so grateful to my co-conspirator and co-organizer, Marisa, the brilliant panelists. I'm grateful for them and their work, all of whom jumped at the chance to honor Saidiya Hartman and Scenes of Subjection. And mostly I'm grateful for the author and her work, who means so much to me. There are books available. The new edition of Scenes of Subjection is available, and it's being sold by the Community Bookstore, which is a Black-owned, New Orleans-based bookstore. So there's limited copies. Some of them will be signed, and so please check that out. I'm just going to anchor us today in Hartman's own words by reading a couple of passages from Scenes. From page 79. In 19th century common law, rape was defined as the forcible carnal knowledge of a female against her will and without her consent. Yet the actual or attempted rape of an enslaved woman was an offense neither recognized nor punished by law. Not only was rape simply unimaginable because of purported Black lasciviousness, but also its repression was essential to the displacement of white culpability that characterized both the recognition of Black humanity in slave law and the designation of the Black subject as the originary locus of transgression and offense. The cases of State of Missouri versus Celia a slave and George v. State averred that the enslaved were not subjects of common law, thus not protected against rape. In other words, slaves were placed solely under the regulation of statutory law and not covered by the common law, though the rape of slave women was not a statutory offense either. Therefore, the repression or effacement of rape can be explained only in part by the inapplicability of common law to the enslaved. Rather, the repression and negation of this act of violence are central not only to the pained constitution of Blackness, but also to the figuration and the deployment of sexuality in the context of captivity. Moreover, the disavowal of rape most obviously involves issues of consent, agency, and will that are ensnared in a larger dilemma concerning the construction of person and the calculation of Black humanity in slave law, since this repression of violence constitutes female gender as the locus of both unredressed and negligible injury. Passage number 2 begins on page 125 of the old version. Emancipation announced the end of chattel slavery. However, it by no means marked the end of bondage. The freed individual was nothing if not burdened, responsible, and obligated. Responsibility entailed accounting for one's actions, dutiful suppliance, contractual obligation, and calculated reciprocity. Fundamentally, to be responsible was to be blameworthy. In this respect, the exercise of free will, quite literally, was inextricable from guilty infractions, criminal misdeeds, punishable transgressions, and an elaborate micropenality of everyday life. Responsibility made man an end in himself, and as such, the autonomous and intending agent was above all else culpable. In this regard, the burden of conscience attendant to the formation of the sovereign individual was decisive, not only in the ways that it facilitated self-disciplining, but also in its ability to engender resentment toward and justify the punishment of those who fell below the threshold of responsibility or failed to achieve the requisite degree of self-control. I'm going to skip a little bit. How does one narrate a story of freedom when confronted with the discrepant legacy of emancipation and the decidedly circumscribed avenues available to the freed? What does autonomy mean in the context of coercion, hunger, and uncertainty? Is the unavoidable double bind of emancipation an illusory freedom and travestied liberation? At the very least, one must contend with the enormity of emancipation as both a breach with slavery and reproduction or reorganization of the plantation system. What follows is an examination of eclipsed possibility and another lament of frailed revolution. The paradox of emancipation involved the coupling of coercion and contract, liberty and necessity, equality and subjection. At the most basic level, this paradox was lived in planter opposition to a free labor system and the subjugation of free labor through contractual and extra-legal means. To understand the case, the South proved unwilling to embrace a free labor system or to tolerate assertions of Black liberty. Moreover, Blacks were blamed for this opposition to free labor, presumably because they entertained fanciful and dangerous notions of freedom and refused to work except under duress. As we shall see, these fanciful notions articulated an alternate imagination of freedom and resistance to the imposition of a new order of constraint.
Thank you, Sarah. Our first speaker is Dr. Kimberly Juanita Brown from Dartmouth University.
Thank you. Hello. Everyone can hear me? Excellent. So I want to start off with my many thanks to Sarah Haley and Marisa Fuentes for convening us this morning, to all of you for being here, and to Saidiya Hartman for the work that makes our work possible. This microphone thing is awkward. Collective work already. Okay. Living as I do in this country of my birth, there are some encounters that are not accessible to me as spaces of comfort or joy, even though they should be. So where there is a forest, I see a slave coffle. I look at the ocean and I think of the Middle Passage, its terrors and distortions. A lullaby reminds me of sorrow songs that were anchored in the air, maybe never to reach the intended beloved. Existing in this space is a wailing that's only audible to some of us, and Saidiya Hartman hears all of it. Scenes of Subjection is my proof of this. For those of us haunted by slavery and everything that has come after it, Scenes of Subjection said, "Here be ghosts." And then let us commune with these ghosts so that we could focus our attention in their direction. I understood this as an invitation, as a way into the archive of slavery, one that I so desperately needed. But unlike other texts and other theorists, this one allowed me, in the words of Toni Morrison, to go to the margins and make it the center. If you were like me, fumbling around in disparate theoretical toolboxes filled with anti-blackness, sprinkled with misogynoir, then Scenes of Subjection was the meditation that opened the world between slavery, freedom, and Black humanity. Importantly, it also opened an avenue of possibility for Black feminist scholarship, and many of us on this panel would have been lost without Hartman's vital intervention. There's a moment where I was like reading the book, and I looked up and I remember saying to myself, oh, I don't hate theory. I hate the theories that I have been reading thus far. And I feel like I had a similar relationship with Morrison's Paradise. I was in a class and everybody was like, oh, I know what's going on. And I'm like, you're not reading if you don't know what's going on. What I had been grappling with as I considered the stakes of my dissertation project was the absence of language that was expansive enough to include the enslaved Black women whose lives and labors seem adjacent to the study of slavery writ large. And so I had a series of kind of awkward encounters with men I called data dudes who insisted on telling me that there were very few Black women enslaved, and I was like, really? I don't think so. So when searching for representations of the horrendous corporeal accounting of the violence, cementing the system and the effect that this had on Black women, I turned to literature and literary representations to do this work. And then I found Scenes of Subjection on a shelf in a Barnes & Noble in Co-op City. And I have to say as well, again, give me some room here. I was a graduate student. I thought somebody left the book there on the shelf for me. There was just one copy. I was looking for the book. This is like 2002, maybe? So it wasn't like Amazon, get the book to your house. So I really believe somebody left it there for me, like some kind of like gift to the dissertation. Anyway, yeah. So in all of its cadence, fluidity, mastery, and writerly precision, I had a profound understanding of the world that slavery made. That is, the world that Morrison tells us has been broken in half by slavery. And so I'm going to give you the full Morrison quote, and that is, slavery broke the world in half. It broke it in every way. It broke Europe. It made them into something else. It made them slave masters. It made them crazy. You can't do that for hundreds of years and it not take a toll. They had to dehumanize, not just the slaves, but themselves. Scenes helps us think about what that brokenness entails, what it envelops, what it endures, and what it inhabits. Here I give you one example of the book's potency posed as a series of questions. How can rape be differentiated from sexuality when consent is intelligible only as submission? How can we discern the crime when it is a legitimate use of property, or when the Black captive is made the originary locus of liability? Does the regularity of violation transform it into an arrangement or a liaison from which the captive female can extract herself if she chooses, as a lover's request or adultery would seem to imply? Can she use or wield sexuality as a weapon of the weak? Do 4 years and 2 children later imply submission, resignation, complicity, desire, or the extremity of constraint? This is the passage that stopped me in my tracks when I was trying to write about representations of Sally Hemings. It is one among so many others giving me permission to ask the questions it seemed needed to be asked. Contrary to our expectations, Hartman writes, sentiment, enjoyment, affinity, will, affection, and desire facilitated domination and terror precisely by preying upon the flesh, the heart, and the soul. Scenes of Subjection asked that we listen to the sound of the questions hovering in the air regarding slavery, to ask them aloud and find a way to reconcile the archive alongside its insistent absences. Lastly, in the poetry of her prose, Hartman is truly unmatched. And that is also why we are here 25 years later to celebrate this work. Open the book and point to any page and read it aloud, and I have. This is a work of art. This is the monument to slavery that Toni Toni Morrison produced in her novel, Beloved. This is the love supreme that Coltrane offered us in 3 parts. It does not surprise me that Hartman initially was intending to write about the blues when the history of slavery made its echoes an essential route to travel down. Scenes of Subjection is the historical marker for the blues. In her new preface to the 25th anniversary edition of Scenes, Hartman says that if it were possible, she might have written it as a 345-page long sentence. And well, I think you did. But I would say it's a 345-page long poem. And for that, I thank you. This book made the fraught relationship with the archive of slavery navigable for me, because now I had a guide. More than this, though. I had a way to attend to the indiscriminate utilization of enslaved people's humanity through their bodies. I had a way to consider what Hartman calls the relentless proliferation of small acts of resistance, and this is something that I can hold on to. I go to a forest or an ocean, listen to a lullaby. I still think about slavery, but now I am more cognizant of the invitation that Scenes of Subjection has afforded me, a way to orient myself in the direction of slavery's history, to see everything that lies beneath the surface. Thank you.
Thank you, Drs. Fuentes and Haley, for the invitation, and Dr. Hartman for providing the words that, again, makes work possible. Oh, you can't hear me. Okay, I'll bring it closer. Thank you. Interestingly enough, I actually found the book on Amazon, but in an early algorithm where I had purchased Black Skin, White Mask as a fresh out of undergrad, wanting more theory, and it brought Scenes of Subjection into my queue, and I was like, oh, I'll give that a try, and read it and went back to grad school and have not stopped thinking about it ever since, so thank you, Hartman. Scenes of Subjection reads as a critical rejoinder on violence. Unlike a text like The Body in Pain, where Elaine Scarry theorizes torture for a generalized, abstracted subject, for Scenes, the object of concern is the violable status of the slave. It is a critique of the Gramscian model, insofar as it challenges what hegemony can mean for the slave, or whether the archive exposes the relation between the slave and the master as wars of positions and maneuvers. Rather, Hartman keenly illustrates that the historical record contains totalizing and terrorizing violations of the slave that bleed across assumed divides. Scenes is a feat of rigor and command, where historiography, critical theory, Black feminism, political theory, and cultural studies are drawn upon to meet the demands of its inquiry. In a recent reflection on the 25th anniversary of the text, Hartman writes, quote, I am struck by the breathlessness of the prose, by its ardent desire to say it all, to say everything at once. Its ardent desire is what gives the monograph its repeated breath, and what continues to reveal the value and necessity of careful complexity when conceptualizing the structural predicaments of Blackness. Today, I will focus my comments on the 3rd chapter, Seduction and the Ruses of Power, which is a chapter I have found myself trapped within for the past 15 years. By trapped, I mean this in all the ways of the word, as in vexing and wildly generative. In this chapter, Hartman takes on the sexual status of the female slave. The interrogation asks, how are we to make sense of or account for an impossible, repetitiously occurring violation that only appears as the disavowed remnants of some other exposure? The vexed nature of the slave's sexual injury, as Hartman crucially argues, demonstrates why, quote, the omission of law must be read symptomatically within an economy of bodies in which the full enjoyment of the slave as thing depends upon unbounded authority and the totalizing consumption of the body in its myriad capacities, end quote. Although important, Hartman cleaves perceptions of the sexual violability of the slave as emerging primarily through the legal denial of rape. While feminist theory has been vastly influential in naming the problem of rape in structures such as sex gender, the body, patriarchy, or the arrangements of the political and private, The assumptive logics from which these theories generally operate are impoverished when considering the sexual status of the slave. As Hartman has argued via a footnote, quote, "It is not simply a matter of a woman's no not being taken seriously, or of unveiling the crime when it looks like sex. What is at heart here is the denial and restricted recognition of will or submission because of the legal construction of black subjectivity and the utter negation of the crime," end quote. What Hartman uncovers is how the question of blackness radically destabilizes the presuppositions of victimhood, consent, suffering, and culpability. This brings into sharp focus contradictory assertions, such as this position espoused by feminist philosopher Anne Cahill, that, quote, "few people, even among philosophers, would claim that rape does not, in virtually all conceivable contexts, constitute a serious moral wrong," end quote. In the case of slave rape, there was no discernible crime of injury. Sexually violating a slave was not conceivable as a moral wrong, but as a necessity for the perpetual operation of the slave estate and the racial sexual order. Hartman approaches rape and sexual violence through the legal archive while highlighting the law's fantasy presentation, where written into slave law is the obsolescence of its use and value for the slave, as it references the slave as a passible indexicality towards the human as the fundamental juridical body. In this respect, is rape an adequate term, given its saturation with logics that are vacant for the slave? Can we superimpose the slave into these categories like woman or victim and claim them as metaphysical presuppositions for sentience? Or are these terms also embedded within the undercurrents of anti-Black sexual violence, which makes them conceivable? Is rape the force of penetrative acts? Or is it a cartography that assumes an integrity of a subject which the slave is denied ab initio? Hartman's treatment of the case of Celia, a slave, most clearly demonstrates the dizzying effects of articulating the implications of forced copulation, law, power, and resistance. Celia had her cabin visited on multiple times by her master. She was also paired with a male slave who resided in her cabin and witnessed the master's repeated entering. Resisting her master's advances, Celia attempted to claim a sexually autonomous self and kills him. For this, she is brought to trial for the crime of murder. Hartman exposes that, quote, "Missouri v. Celia illustrates how difficult it is to uncover and articulate the sexual violence of enslaved women exactly because the crime surfaces obliquely and only as the captive confesses her guilt," end quote. This evaluation of the case illumines that in confessing guilt for resisting, the act of sexual violation is uncovered, meaning that it is the resistant act that produces the possibility for sexual violation to appear in the legal archive. Perversely so, there is no record of the sexual act itself, outside of the impermissibility of Celia's right to resist, which brings the sexual nature of the repeated offenses to the surface. What positions Celia in a condition of sexual violability, forced resistance, and death is infinitely reproduced and replicated for slaves on in. Missouri v. Celia attunes attention to the normation of death and sexual violence under slavery, where Celia is sentenced to be, quote, "hanged by the neck until death on the 16th day of November, 1855, end quote. The act of hanging Celia upends the notion that upon the exit of the last breath, that when death arrives on the scene, the body is what vanishes. The terror of slavery is the recognition that death becomes operable drives towards new violating potentials. That is captured in the ability to reproduce and replicate the slave as devoid of a body or bios, which is to say the slave is pure violation even upon and after death. As death constituted by racial sexuation is a predicament of absent life reproduced by the ontological void of sex-gender primacy for the slave. When death appears, it exposes that the slave never possessed a singular body. This absence of bodily form as a metaphysical or individualistic substrate is located precisely in its sexual fecundity. Though it is undeniable that slaves made life out of their conditions, the disruptions that were constitutive of slavery disallows these life forms to institute permanence or equality that could rewrite the slave's relationship to violation. What Celia and other cases like hers animate is that the resistance of the slave, the acting back against the sexual act,
does not set in motion a paradigmatic redress of the act. Rather, these instances become substance in a web of materiality and matter that speaks to the infinite nature of sexual violence for the slave and the various ways in which it appears and disappears in the historical record. Predicating thought on the legality of sexual violence or resistance attunes focus to the social and political predicaments of the slave, yet profoundly disregards the slave's psychic significance. The slave is an empty signifier that can be granted particularity, but in its crudest forms exist as pure passibility. At the most primal stage, what drives the fantasy of what makes a slave is its unrestrained embodiment of sexual functionality and its ability to fight back against this designation. Through its sexual viability, the slave reproduces a matrix of sexuation from which it regains no possessive integrities of sexual making, no kin, no body, no history, no ontology, no future. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Denise Ferreira de Silva at UBC.
Okay. Good morning. Thanks, Sarah and Marisa, for the invitation to take part of this important conversation. I could not make up my mind, so I prepared 3 things. I'm not going to do all of them. I'll do one and see how far I can go, but I'll not go beyond 10 minutes, I think. Thanks, Saidiya, for writing this book. This book that I have been teaching every year for almost 10 years now in a required graduate seminar. And the title of the seminar is Groundwork for a Transformative Theory of Justice. Each reading is guided by the questioning of the concepts pertaining to modern ideals of justice. Each time we read the book in the course, we ask scenes of subjection to foreground and elaborate and disintegrate these ideals. In particular, the 2 central concepts, humanity and subjectivity, both of which, as we know, were assembled in the 19th century episteme, which is at the same moment when raciality was also assembled and to complement, constitute, and if we put enough pressure and heat, to complicate and cancel these concepts. Each and every one of these years, including this year, every time I return to the book, I reread it again, I read it again with my students, and I learn how to read it again. The students, every year, they got stuck puzzling over the problem of empathy. Every year has been the same. Most of the times the question is not explicitly asked, but sometimes it is. How come? How is it that empathy is not a good thing in itself? How can it be such a violent gesture? Why is that the attribution of humanity to the enslaved person would amount to an occupation of their interiority? But that's my formulation of the question. But the students all have their different versions of it. But as I was preparing for today, I was like, what else can I say? What we know already, that scenes of subjection is, among many other things, as an account of the centrality of violence in the making of the liberal political architecture, in particular of authorized violence in the juridic status of the enslaved. It shows how the intimacy of the ethic and economic moments. It is a poignant, beautifully written, and brilliantly argued example of what happens when blackness guides thinking, when the critical gesture goes a step beyond unpacking and exposing, when it is also a moment of refusal, but one which applies just enough pressure to unleash and hasten the movement of redecomposition. And I have written about the philosophical significance of Saidiya's, the philosophical, I don't want to say nature, but the intervention in philosophy that Saidiya makes in this book and in others. And this is something else that I brought, but I'm not gonna read that one because it's there anyway. So I'm doing something else I hope I have time to do it, which is number 3. And it's basically a presentation of scenes of subjection, but in the form of fourfold. Is a fourfold, which comes about from answering 4 questions. It's a reading of sorts. The questions are: what scenes of subjection has taught us to attend to? What or how it encourages us to think about it? What it teaches us not to attend to? And what is the principal statement? Of course, I could write 10,000 words for each one of these, but I have fewer than that. So what scenes of subjection has taught us to attend to? Well, the sense given in the image that I got is that of limits and of the limiting effect of the prevailing mode of thinking, of its tools and products. There are 2 elements in the image, the predominant one, air, and the other one, water. Air is what governs the image. It refers to things intellectual, but also to violence, to strife, and water, obviously, to feelings and emotions. It is difficult not to read it in the image of the image of self, of the self-possessed individual about which Saidiya writes. If water refers to feelings and emotions, and I like the term permeation, and also to deep connections, I prefer deep implication, then science also teaches us how to attend to that, to 2 things that have always been part of the assembling of the self-possessed individual, and that it might also be a way out of its violent means of existence, which are both physically and intellectually signaled by air. And the whole image is an image of captivity, but it shifts it. The second is what and how it encourages us to think about it. And the image I get here is that of the challenges to reconcile 2 dimensions usually seen as opposed to one another, like reason and emotion, for instance. Yeah, but the duality, while the duality seems to be the dominant theme here, the major figure represented can also be read as a referent of interiority. The theme is reconciliation, but reconciliation without effort, as something that comes about when one, or after one stops and gives some attention to the matter. I would say that this indicates a different way of conceiving of interiority, one other than the one that leads to the situation in the previous image, the captivity one. But this is open. 3, what it teaches us not to attend to. The image here is that of the poet, a romantic figure of feelings and emotions. It could be about not acting in such a way, but I'm still thinking about it. And if you want to comment on that, what we do with not do with the poet here. And what is the principal statement? I love the image that comes in the position because it's an image of realization, of culmination, but it's also an image of ideas and possibilities that are just still that. They have not landed yet, but they are about to do so. To me, it indicates several things. Let me mention 2. First, I think it is an image of the generous generativity that writes scenes of subjection. Saidiya's intellectual transforming fire, a force that heats up thinking and activates that heats up others' thinking and activates their own generativity. It is also at the same time not air, but flames. They have replaced the blades in this image. And I'll stop here now.
Our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Morgan from NYU.
Hello, everybody. It's really amazing. Saidiya, at some point you have to turn around and see this audience who is gathered here in such numbers to hear us talk about the importance of this work. I always learn something new when I revisit scenes of subjection, and as anyone who's read my work, or heard me lecture on the 17th century origins of racial capitalism knows, I am always also glad to say publicly and with gusto that I owe a tremendous debt to Saidiya Hartman, to Scenes, and to her later work. My thinking on slavery is so influenced by and entangled with Saidiya that it is almost impossible for me to separate out the strands. And so when I revisit Scenes, I am struck most profoundly by what I owe. Hartman asks, quote, what happens if we assume that the female subject serves as a general case for explicating social death, property relations, and the pained and punitive construction of blackness? For me, this question, asked in the third chapter of Scenes, is the one that aligns most clearly with my own efforts to unearth the experiential and structural dimensions of women's experience of enslavement in the early modern Black Atlantic world. It sets me in motion. The answer to the question changes, but I ask it again and again with certainty that because of the alchemy of race and gender, if I center the lives of enslaved women, I am more able to fully engage with what the institution of slavery actually wrought for the enslaved, for slave owners, and for the economies of slave-owning nations. I've spent my whole career ruminating over what birth meant to the enslaved woman, particularly in the 17th century context of newly emergent slave societies, where I find a space of uncertainty, settlements barely carved out from the landscape, Englishmen as yet unclear about the source of their profound disregard for the lives of the enslaved. It's been important for me to stay there, to avoid the lure of the 19th century, in part because it keeps me off balance, always mindful of what I cannot know because of the violent erasures that constitute the archive of the early modern. The far remove is the tool that forces me to concede the ground of what is unknowable and what is unthinkable in much the way that Hartman's meticulous thinking and close reading exemplifies both, which is exemplified both in Scenes and everywhere else. But I want to talk about Hartman as a historian. Yesterday, I attended a panel on my colleague Thuy Thu's work, Experiments in Skin, and she spoke at length there about what it meant for her to turn to the archives after beginning a project that she intended to be primarily ethnographic. On a different, though adjacent register from Toni Morrison's Crazy World Broken Open, Thuy said that she was astonished to find, after enduring the tedium and dead ends of archival research, that there were moments in the archive when you feel like the world has cracked open, when you see something so clearly. Hartman has become so powerfully associated with the brilliance of critical fabulation that I think sometimes it becomes easy to overlook that the power of that intervention is deeply and fundamentally rooted in her intimate and tenacious relationship to archival research. In Scenes, again and again, she walks us through archival evidence that cracks the world open. And she does so with a set of records that prior to her sojourn had often been dismissed as unreliable, as was the case of the WPA narratives, or utilized kind of prosaically with court case and plantation records. Hartman exhorts us in her notes on method to, quote, reclaim archival material for contrary purposes, to use them to write a different account of the past. When encountering Scenes for the first time, and I remember, it was a while ago, I have my archival piece of evidence, the different encounter of the past is breathtaking. When returned to again and again, it compels one to reconsider the archive as a space of abundance. Bear with me here. Filled with meaning and evidence about Black life and death, if only we sit there with it and reclaim it for the truths that have set us on the path to where we are. I imagine, and forgive me if I oversimplify, that many here in attendance in this audience and in this room are primarily drawn to Hartman's work for all that she has given us regarding the afterlives of slavery. But for me, Scenes has always been a provocation to hone my gaze in the other direction. And so I stay there, sifting through the records of early modern slave ships, looking for women, knowing that they will only come to me tethered to rape and pregnancy and miscarriage and each other's deaths and the deaths of infants and the forced care they are made to bestow on children and adults to whom they may not have been kin, but who may have become so during unthinkable voyages. These glimpses of violation that cling to their archival presence are, of course, evidence of their commodification, of the brutal calculations that rendered them into items on balance sheets, even as notions of kinship formation adhered. And so I pick at the wound of kinship and birth, asking for the clarity of uncertainty or something like that, only to arrive at the brutal calculus of self-betrayal. Hartman uses this phrase to think about forced pleasure, about the singing or dancing while on the coffle. I grasp it and use it to think through the act of birthing a child who is immediately claimed as someone else's property, whose existence confirms to you the multiple ways that you feel the insatiable appetite of slave traders and slave owners. I've recently used the phrase the kinlessness born in an enslaved woman's womb to describe the process that I'm gesturing towards this morning. Here, as elsewhere, I draw on Hartman to help me navigate the dangerous conceptual terrain of birth and longing for connection. For kinship is precisely what is forestalled by legislating racial inheritance through the bodies of black women raped by white slave owners, whose children most assuredly did not acquire kinship ties to white families through the act of their conception. Instead, and here again I use scenes to help me think through this point, quote, kinship and captivity designate radically different conditions of embodiment, close quote. This point comes shortly after the first passage that we heard this morning, that Sarah read this morning. The refusal of black kinship, of course, does enormous work in the colonial setting to articulate the importance of kinship for Englishmen, and thus instantiates the clarification of whiteness as the source of English authority and power in the colony. And here's that moment where understanding the world through the embodied experience of enslaved women helps you to understand the world that's being created in opposition and through them. My point is that I labor in a very different archive, but follow a path through it that's lit by the questions that Hartman formulated in Scenes. In her discussion of the forced gaiety demanded of the enslaved as they were being sold at market, she concluded that the simulation of consent in the context of extreme domination was an orchestration intent upon making the captive body speak the master's truth, as well as disproving the suffering of the enslaved. I sat with that for some time, and I continue to mull over all that is packed into the simulation of consent. Clearly, I find a most powerful instantiation of it in reproduction, to quote a later formulation of Saidiya Hartman's, in the birth canal as a middle passage. What I want to insist on recognizing about this terrain on which this kinlessness, this racial dispossession emerges, is I recognize that the terrain is unfamiliar to us and that the discomfort born of that strangeness is productive, as it is in that space that I can theorize the possible experiential dimensions of what Hartman calls this savage quantification of life. The mistake of assuming that there's something ahistorical about birth or family formation or kinship is avoided, and the effort of inhabiting the unknown is productive and generative in ways exemplified by Hartman's archival methodological depth in Scenes. And so the unfathomable, the moment of recognition for the woman who understands that her reproductive potential has been brutally transformed. The reality that this intimate corporeal doubling actually signifies one's aloneness, the destruction of kinship, the refusal of the society in which one is now involuntarily enmeshed to recognize you as a person in and with family. The coffles are in the future, the forced gaiety at the site of sale, the realities that birth rates are going to fuel this massive internal slave trade, sending 1 million descendants of African slaves, both adults and children, into the lower South. All of that is the terrain on which Scenes of Subjection rests, and that is coming in my work. It's not there. But what is there is this dawning sense of the depths of self-betrayal to which the woman claiming to be someone's mother, who imagined that kinship was conferred through her body, had sunk. I'm interested in that moment of recognition, not in the experience of childbirth per se, but in the comprehension, the re-understanding of what the birth of the child now meant for an enslaved woman. It is there that terror is barely discerned, but where it lived, viscerally, profoundly, and generatively. My ability to seek that moment of recognition, to feel fully confident that it is there, to recognize and apprehend the impact of violence and of comprehension is rooted in the scholarly example set by Professor Hartman now 25 years ago. So again, thank you.
Our next speaker is Matthew D. Morrison, coming from NYU.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. All right, I'll just move up here. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. Wow. I'm just going to read my text. I have an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the opportunity to honor the work of Saidiya Hartman, along with my luminary colleagues, as we gather to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the publication of Scenes of Subjection. I am especially grateful to do so, as my first model of radical Black feminism, my mother, Charmaine Morrison, is in the audience to bear witness to this celebration. And for me, this is also a celebration of my mom and her own brilliance and love, as I would literally not be here, physically or capably, if it were not for her and her teachings. In a 2017 Women and Performance article titled The Sounds of Subjection, I'm somehow a little embarrassed by the title now. I wrote about my second year of graduate school at Columbia University when I took a course titled The Haunted Visualities, co-taught by Saidiya Hartman and Tina Compt, Black Feminist Musical Subcultures with Daphne Brooks, and Analyzing American Popular Music with Elie Hissama. Okay? During my graduate studies in musicology, I recognized this as a semester in which my research on the relationship between sound performance and identity began to take shape, and how fortunate I was to share this experience with some of my colleagues who are in this very room. I used that brief article as an opportunity to elucidate how I have developed a theory of Black sound, capital B, one word, which I define most simply as a sonic complement to blackface minstrelsy, and how this concept builds upon the foundational work that Saidiya Hartman provides in Scenes. It would not exist without it. Ironically, we did not read Scenes in the course that I took with Professor Hartman in 2009, but I was introduced to this work through my dear friends and graduate school colleagues in that same semester, where we talked about it a lot, okay? And I have been carrying this around for 13 years, quite honestly, like a Bible. I mean, it's real, as we all know. And so for me, Scenes carries within it a political import through tone, method, and spirit that informs the stakes behind my own research as a musicologist, specifically in relation to the political and aesthetic functioning of American popular music and the lived experiences of Black people. It also carefully detailed things to me that I have felt in my spirit and the marrow of my bones about the legacies and the impact of Black music and American music as a Black Southerner and a violinist. In The Hold of Slavery, the preface to the 25th anniversary of Scenes, Hartman notes a particular thread that has received less attention in the critical discourse that has emerged from the book, as she notes that, quote, Black performance and quotidian practice were determined by and exceeded the constraints of domination, end quote. I want to take my remaining few minutes to consider how the concept of Black sound, again, capital B, one word, is determined by this very notion that sounds produced by Black people, Black space sounds, which I will never think that I can define singularly, right? This is a multitudinous expression, right? Coming from a diverse group of peoples. And so while these musical, pardon me, I said that I was not going to be doing this fast to keep in my time. So I want to take these few minutes to consider how these musical performances simultaneously resonate beyond the constraints of white supremacy that structure the machinations of popular music, its commodification, and society at large. This is an attempt to highlight, as Hartman points out again in the preface to Scenes, quote, the entanglement of humanity and violence, liberal philosophy and racial reason, the human and its devalued others, end quote. The story of Black sound is one that extends beyond ideas of appropriation and authenticity that often surround discussions of blackface and American popular music. Within Black sound, the lens through which fear, desire, fascination, and mimicry collide through blackface performance is considered through the formulation of terror and enjoyment. Through this dyad, Hartman notes that the economy and culture of, quote, enjoyment was predicated on the wanton uses of slave property. It was attributed to the slave in order to deny, displace, and minimize the violence of slavery, end quote. In other words, blackface performances turned black suffering into pleasure for white participants, while simultaneously drawing upon blackness as a source of aesthetic property under slavery through blackface and developing copyright laws in the mid-19th century. This manipulation of black aesthetics, sounds, and movements that liberated the bodies of non-black and white participants during blackface signals how, quote, the liberal expression of freedom had been built on the bedrock of slavery, end quote, especially within the fashioning of American popular music. Most of these, some of the quotes that I'm drawing from here are coming from the preface because I was really moved to think through how Saidiya Hartman is reflecting on her own relationship to the work 25 years later that I found was very useful for my own project. So Black sound signals both an aesthetic phenomena, a concept, as well as an analytical tool, a theory for addressing the complex historical relationship and the entanglement between identity, performance, and property within American popular music. Through Black sound, I trace the birth of blackface and sound and movement that lays the foundation for the aesthetic, structural, legal, political, and racialized components of American popular music and entertainment within the context of chattel slavery. I follow the ways in which blackness is ventriloquized as the arbiter of popular sound as I consider what performances constitute its actual aesthetic making. My consideration centers who is doing the performing, the listening, the consumption, the scripting, and the regulation of these sounds into modes of property to be contained through publications like sheet music, as well as performances both live and recorded. Saidiya Hartman notes in the preface that the subject of freedom and the limits of personhood are bound indissolubly to property, end quote. To this end, I also developed the concept of intellectual performance property, the sonic and corporeal practices developed by Black people within Black music and popular music at large, to both recognize and acknowledge the property value inherent in Black performance, even as it continues to elude both Black claims to sonic and musical authorship within most copyright laws today. I agree with both Hartman and Ronaldo Walcott, as Walcott states in his work on property that, quote, Black people will not be fully be able to breathe, a word I do not use lightly, until property itself is abolished, end quote. My concept of intellectual performance property, however, is an attempt to, quote, capture the temporal entanglement of racial slavery as our past and our present, end quote. Again, drawing from Hartman's current preface. The phonic materiality to think about the work of Fred Moten here produced by the excess of Black sonic aesthetics continue to resonate within the commercial industry and the copyright laws that define whose and which aesthetics might be claimed as IP or made public domain, especially during the antebellum period, out of which popular entertainment emerges. Because sound and movement were largely left out of copyright law for most of the 19th century, the very sounds that originated in localized Black communities, that is the blues scale that developed out of the harmonic practices from Black folk spirituals, have been ontologically understood as part of the public domain since slavery. As Saidiya Hartman notes, quote, hidden away in loopholes of retreat and hushed arbors, gathered on the river or dwelling in the swamp, the enslaved articulated a vision of freedom that far exceeded that of the liberal imagination, end quote. This freedom of expression was founded heavily upon the Black performance practices and rituals that developed intra-communally, and many of these practices preceded the colonial encounter, even as they were reimagined under the property regimes of slavery and continue to be so in its afterlife. Black sound enables a material reconstruction of the often ephemeral sounds and movements of Black people that continue to cut and resist its regulation, even as it continues to be exploited and contribute to the making of anti-Blackness. It does so even as these performances are co-opted within systems and industries that seek to silence them as commodities under regulatory regimes and notions of intellectual property that emerged during slavery under copyright. An application of the concepts reconsiders the right and whose right to claim authorship over performance practices beyond the capitalistic systems that have taken ownership over them in the history of popular music and its construction. Black sound challenges assumptions that these performances should not be protected under copyright, or the assumption that the law is actually able to offer protection for the sonic and corporeal innovations of Black people in the first place. Black Sound, Making Race and Popular Music in the United States, which is the title of my book currently under contract with the University of California Press, might provoke further studies that deconstruct the relationship between sound, performance, and intellectual property in the making of pop music and culture. Through Black Sound, as it is a part of the lineage of thought of scenes of subjection, we might interrogate our understandings of how racialized sound and performance played into the construction of individual and collective racialized identities, as well as the structures of copyright and property law within the industry of popular music. This concept also provides a model for how we might remake the music industrial practices structurally and aesthetically in pursuit of justice, repair, and potential reparations within a system designed for commercial exploitation until it's abolished or crumbles. Scenes of Subjection has given me the tools, courage, and charge to pursue this study of the legacies of sounds produced by Black people and their commercial exploitation through popular music and entertainment since slavery in both its spectacular and quotidian forms. So thank you for this work and provocation, Professor Hartman.
Our final speaker is Emily A. Owens from Brown University.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marisa and Sarah, for organizing us. And thank you, Professor Hartman, for writing, but also for being here to let us vet you. I'd also love to thank my fellow panelists. I'm going to start by talking about the material object of this book that I have here with me. But I think also I'm really struck by the immersive quality of our comments collectively, by the ways that particular aspects of this book get recursively turned to, that we share them, that we teach them. And I think as a recipient of, as a recipient of the gifts of this book, and as a person for whom this book is the condition of possibility for my own historical inquiry, but also as a recipient of the mentorship, the teaching that literally is on this panel, in a very material sense. I think I'm really struck by the ways that this book also lives as a symbol of a particular mode of being in academic spaces that are constrained by and are shaped by, but don't exist and don't take their definitional contours from living within the corporate university that exceed them tremendously. And I think this book and the opportunity to pause and think about it and with it is a moment to remember, what are we doing here? So in packing up to come here, I popped by my office to pick up my old tattered copy, this one, thumbed through, scribbled on, of Scenes. And I dashed to my office on the way to the airport, hastily looking around my office. With a bit of panic, is it even here, was the question, because it so often isn't. My copy of Scenes leaves my office all the time, in the hands of my students. Also, I think maybe my copy once belonged to my sister. Like, I think maybe we switched 10 years ago by mistake and then carried on. Scenes is among a rarefied, I think dignified, collection of texts that I actually don't have my first copy of. Like my copy of Tricia Rose's Longing to Tell, Evelyn Higginbotham's Righteous Discontent, Patricia Williams's Alchemy of Race and Rights, and the incomparable collection Racing Justice, Engendering Power, all of which I first purchased as a college student from the slim end cap bookcase that housed African American studies in the used books basement of the bookstore. I don't have those first copies of these books, and have instead a newly tattered copy of each because they're so frequently in use. Lent to a student completing comprehensive exams, lent to an undergraduate for the summer, lent to a colleague who needed a copy for a class that wasn't available online, photocopied, scanned, sometimes borrowed long enough that I had to buy another copy, circulated. I start with the materiality of Scenes because I am moved by the materiality of the thing. I want to stay with the object of the book, which for me is dense with intergenerational Black feminist meaning because of its in-community circulation. Even as Scenes is required reading in many fields, the text, or my copy of the book, it has an intimate life, one that expresses a tradition of knowledge sharing, of knowledge working, and care of objects, of texts, of one another, of our shared and divergent histories through our books. I want to stay with something intimate about our work, and to the extent to which Professor Hartman wrote these words with her hands. I'm reminded of the words of Jennifer Nash, who spoke this summer with great tenderness about our books and the way that they move us, but also they move with us and they move among us. We're in a moment now in Black feminist studies of kind of recursive celebration, and what a good thing that is. We have been celebrating a lot of anniversaries lately of texts that formed the foundation of this field, which I think tells us something about the field, its persistence, its partial institutionalization. We're old enough to have a set of foundational texts. I am young enough to be the recipient of those foundational texts, and that's a good thing. We are marking our own time. We are marking our staying power. I also want to mark those million quotidian gestures, those material gestures, the sharing, the insisting, the returning that have filled that time, the reading and the writing, the readers' reports that say, go back and remember, the Twitter threads that say, cite, 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 the office hours appointments that introduce a text that we might assume just exists, that we might assume it just exists, just is, but for a student is new. The conversation with a student that says, this is hard, but it is worth it. Take it slow. Start with chapter 3. Okay, also, underscoring the symbolic importance of this book, the object, the tool, should not displace its content, the tools that Hartman gifted to this field and that we have continued to tarry with for a quarter century. Scenes of Subjection is the condition of possibility of my own research, which attempts to recapitulate, reanimate, and to archivally sketch the ideological, legal, and cultural contours in answer to Hartman's question, what is the meaning of sexuality when rape is the primary mode of its deployment? Scenes inaugurated a new way of engaging with the history of sexual violence and slavery, which historians in the 1980s and 1990s attempted mostly as a descriptive project around so-called rape and slavery, a kind of fully loaded cost accounting, pace Nell Painter, that would document the material conditions that Jennifer Morgan succinctly captured later in her own dare to the field of slavery studies. Women were there. So Hartman did something different. If, as Keeanga-Yamada Taylor offers in her introduction to the new edition, quote, Scenes of Subjection does not retell the history of slavery and emancipation. Instead, Hartman is asking us to think differently about these events. Then Hartman asked us to think differently about sex and sexual violence. Her question, what is the meaning of sexuality when rape is the primary mode of its deployment? And here I'm again struck by the way that that question has really animated some of our comments. So that question asked us to, in addition to the project of chronicling sexual harm and slavery, to rethink the project of sexuality itself. The question, simplified as I read it, is what is the meaning of sexuality? The question is not what is the meaning of rape. This suggests sexuality as a modern or liberal way of knowing, as an epistemological, and so it is an epistemological pressure point at the intersection of Black history and queer theory. If one of the celebrated and enduring contributions of Scenes has been its critique of liberalism and thus its critique of agency, that which has moved me in this way, is the way that Hartman asks us to extend that critique to sexuality. And so I turn to pleasure, that celebrated watchword of queer studies, which meets its liberal underpinnings in Scenes, in Hartman's damning critique of enjoyment, but also, and I think more importantly, in the framing of that question, what of sexuality, she asks, when rape is its mode? which is to say, sexuality is imagined as a subjective experience belonging to a subject who has desires, whose actualized desires consolidate as pleasure. When we begin our stories with enslaved women, Hartman's provocation requires a suspicion of sexuality itself. Have we contended with pleasure? Hartman's discussion of consent as a quagmire for enslaved women, who were conscripted in the law as, she writes, quote, both will-less and always willing, rather than a simple site of exclusion, suggests that sexuality and its forms, consent, desire, pleasure, was the vector that secured racist misogyny in slavery. Hartman's discussion of Celia, who she describes as, quote, inhabited by sexuality, raises the stakes of pleasure as an analytic and raises suspicion too. Scenes does not foreclose the possibility of a body or of a good feeling in or around that body, but her seduction puts pressure on the binary proposition that pleasure could meet and face down pain, suggesting instead that pleasure was part of violence's apparatus. If she writes, slavery produced, quote, a context in which joy and domination and use and violence could not be separated, then pleasure does not arrive unsullied. We've become, I think, accustomed to being suspicious of freedom as a category, even as we strive to get free. Hartman asks us to stay with that suspicion around pleasure, too. More concretely, the work of historicizing and parsing the ideology of enslaved non-subjecthood and the particularities of enslaved women's legal personality at the level of their sexual use suggests that Black women did not possess some authentic consent that they reserved for some space outside of their legal, social, and economic reality. For what would it mean to suggest that an outside of slavery could exist in any kind of everyday, lived sense? Hartman thus opened the way for curiosity about other meaning-making metrics through which enslaved women may have undertook their erotic lives. Without foreclosing the possibility of something called pleasure or erotics entirely, Hartman's seduction suggests that these categories require at least significant scrutiny and also provokes the question, isn't it possible that a person who endured perpetual sexual violence did not turn toward her body as a site of recovery? Such a person might seek out avenues of escape from the corporeal, as Jana Brown suggests, toward, quote, this is Brown, other temporal dimensions and ethereal cartographies, wherein the body was experienced primarily through, quote, divine power, visions, dreams, premonitions, and other examples of the divine working through her. Jana Brown's exploration of 19th century Black women fanatics expands modes of thinking about intimacy, sex, bodies, and joy from the perspective of the women themselves, dwelling in the profound simplicity that, quote, not all touch involves flesh in the same way. Similarly, it is possible that someone who had experienced serialized hate of her body might turn toward, as Stephanie Camp beautifully elucidated, sites of non-erotic or differently erotic somatic experiences, like coiffure and soft fabric. Indeed, Jessica Johnson's revelation of the consistency of enslaved people's community dinners and dances and the fluid simultaneity of, quote, communal labor, time together, and the gastronomical pleasures of spicy food in the face of deadly punishment demonstrates how very high the stakes were for enslaved people's occupation of their bodies. It strikes me that pleasure constrains the epistemological field and thus flattens the myriad forms of bodily and non-bodily experience with which enslaved women and Saidiya Hartman's more recent frame might have experimented. Slavery would have mangled the terms around which enslaved women's bodies made sense to them. Hartman's emphasis on slavery's mechanisms as not simple exclusion from the promises of liberal subjectivity also invites a deep scrutiny of liberalism's promises itself, including the premise of sexuality as an expression of the intact liberal subject. This suggests that enslaved women's expertise on their own condition might require something other than a requisition of that body and its pleasures, but would exist on a different terrain entirely. I'm going to quote Hartman in Scenes at length, if I may. Quote, what does sexuality designate when rape is a normative mode of its deployment? What set of effects does it produce? How can rape be differentiated from sexuality when consent is intelligible only as submission? How can we discern the crime when it is a legitimate use of property, or when the black captive is made the originary locus of liability? Does the regularity of violation transform it into an arrangement or a liaison from which the captive female can extract herself? Do 4 years and 2 children later imply submission, resignation, complicity, desire, or the extremity of restraint? I think those are open questions. Which is to say, Professor Hartman, in Scenes you gave us our questions. Thank you for giving us our questions. Returning to where I began, to the circulation of this book, sharing, reading, rereading, carrying these ideas and questions, letting them shape what we can see in our archives, we are still working these questions. We aren't done yet, which is to say that Scenes isn't done yet. Thank you.
I think we can give one more thank you to all of our panelists for that. Amazing. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. I'm going to hand you the mic back, who's going to raise a question, and then we'll open it up for audience.
Okay, it's really hard to speak and formulate one question from all of that that you have given us. So I do want to leave a lot of time for all of the interlocutors and friends of Scenes that are in the audience. I see so many powerful writers and thinkers and folks that I have talked about this book with. So I'll just ask one question. Anyone who has a response can, but we want to save time for Q&A in the audience. I'm struck by, for such an anti-disciplinary book, everyone on the panel was so disciplined in terms of time, so we have some time. I actually wanted to ask a question that's very much along the lines of Emily Owens' thought, which is how we have traveled with this book. Kimberly Brown and I went to graduate school together. This book was with us when we saw Saidiya speak. She bravely went with me up, or encouraged me to go up and get it signed after a talk in grad school. It meant a lot to us in community and in collectivity. And so my question is just about sort of how this book has either encouraged conversations with others in the field, how it has cracked open for you questions of field, or exposed the limits of the paucity of fields. How has it made you more courageous? I know that it has for me. So if anyone wants to talk about that.
All right. I think that when I think of Scenes, when I think of Saidiya's, I was about to say contribution, but that's not right, like the ways in which your work exemplifies this moment of collective engagement with the problem of slavery, it feels to me fundamentally interdisciplinary, fundamentally a text that enabled conversations. When I was in graduate school, which was before this was published, it was not, historians were historians and literary critics were literary critics, right? And the idea that those of us who were working in archives should be thinking carefully alongside those of you who are working as in areas of culture and expression still felt a little dangerous, right? Like we were supposed to be, we had a methodology that was distinctive. And I think that what Scenes does is it doesn't just enable, but it demands a kind of interdisciplinary collective engagement with the problem that is so huge. And it gives us a language that says we have to spend a lot of time thinking through the problem of slavery. We can't, you know, it's hard. Take it slow. Start with chapter 3. And that to linger, and to linger with each other. Not only to linger in solitude, but to linger with each other, I think is one of the kind of material takeaways of this work and of the enduring importance of this work.
And so I was, absolutely. So I was just going to second the kind of vibrant interdisciplinary permission to do that. And then, you know, it solved some very kind of complex problems simply for me, and that is, if you see it, it's probably there, right? So that was profound enough to carry me through my dissertation project, where everybody was telling me there was nothing to see there.
I think for me, in terms of thinking about the transit of the text, like how you carry it, I literally carried it on the BART train with me every day to a nonprofit job that felt like nothing. And standing up, trying to hold on to walls and read this book that was extremely dense and using words I'd never really heard before. But I was drawn to it because I was immersed in the prison abolition struggle at that time, and organizing and really wanting to rethink what we were imagining as the failed promise of slavery's abolition. And this book said something to me about that, and I still have that copy, and I still have notations in the margins that make me laugh because they're a little bit naive, and they're like, this is like abolition, like prison abolition, PIC abolition, things like that, you know? But it was generative enough for me to say, have we really thought concretely about everything that emerged? Can we position a liberal fantasy of abolition as food, water, shelter, education, decarceration, the abolition of the police as enough? What about the psychic contours that pervade what it means to be Black? And those were questions that I could not answer easily. And they sent me back to grad school. And in terms of the sort of methodology or disciplinarity of the text, I liked its unruliness because I was an unruly Black girl. Everyone kept saying, well, what are your methods? How do you think your thoughts? And I'm like, I'm a theorist. I just think theory. And they're like, that's not good enough. And this book told me it was actually just right. And I've been moving forward on that authorization ever since. And it has been wildly, like I said, vexing and generative to work in this modality ever since. So thank you again, Hartman.
Emily, you were so generous, and I realized that I'm not as generous as I thought, because I have never lent this book to anyone.
Wild.
Ever. So kudos to you. I need to be more generous. But the first place that I think about, again, is graduate school. So I'm looking at my colleague Arnold Womack, and I mean, you know, this book was, again, we didn't do it in class. It was my colleagues in English and comparative literature and Black studies who were just talking about it. And I was like, okay, clearly I need to figure out what's going on here. It taught me how to read theory, right? As I'm in a conservative discipline of musicology, even more so 15 years ago when I started grad school. It's shifted now, but we're still contending with the same sort of white supremacist notions of what is okay to study and not, and what is reputable and what have you. But this is really, so this was a community building material work. We just had an orbit around this book, right? And also like a critical relationship to interrogating what was being asked of us as we were reading along with it, right? And particularly with musicology, I feel like it, metaphorically, I carried it with me there into a conservative field that would try to deny certain types of claims, or who wanted to write off a discussion of Black performance as essentialist, or who didn't want to think about how American popular music and any type of music that comes out of the West is steeped in the legacy of slavery. If you're talking about popular music, if you're teaching a class on popular music in America, the United States, globally really, because blackface was a worldwide phenomenon in the mid-19th century, Japan, Australia. Anyways, so. I'm sorry, y'all. The point is that this particular work has allowed me to make sure that that folks can't get past slavery in popular music unless they are intentionally trying to do so within my field. And so it has been useful for a number of ways for me, both in terms of community building, but also in really sort of making certain political, claims and stakes within my own field that I lay claim to, because in class, Saidiya would tell me, you're the musicologist, you're the specialist. Like, what do you think about this, right? And so that has been just, very forming for how I enter into my own work, interdisciplinary as a musicologist.
So we have time. We have about 20 minutes for questions and comments and reflections on the book. Doesn't have to necessarily be in the form of a question for us, but yeah.
Can I really quickly answer that by
Yes.
quoting my panelists sitting
Yes.
here? I took out my book, my notebook, to write down that Kimberly Juanita Brown's piece was astonishingly evocative. She writes as a poet in a conversation with Hartman that makes all of us want to eavesdrop on it. So Joan Morgan, thank you very much for that question, because I feel like there is this incredible attention to language as the vehicle through which we can try to get to this thing that is so unspeakable, that is a poetics, and there's no question that circulates around the many contributions that Saidiya has made to our conversations. But I had to write down your poetics because they were so good.
I also want to take a stab at answering that just very materially, which is I remember the moment in graduate school when Kimberly Juanita Brown said to me, having seen,
Oh my.
don't let them stomp all of the creativity out of you. You can be creative and do this. And it was literally with this book. So I second everything that Jennifer just said.
I'll answer that question because I often teach, chapter 3, I often teach ruses in a lesson about history and theory. And as a how-to for undergraduates, how do you read these things? They read differently. And I think that often what I experience when I assign parts of scenes to my students is, because I teach history classes, a real reaction. This is really hard, it's over my head, it was really too hard. And I think actually that I find it a really useful teaching moment to reveal also the different kind of seduction of historical writing and the ways that the tidiness of narrative makes it seem like things were straightforward, or that makes it seem like our understanding of the past is straightforward. And so it's actually a really useful space also. It's generative for me intellectually to live with the prose and the openness of it, actually. I mean, I really dwelled in my comments on the many questions in the text because I think they're not actually done. I think they remain open in many ways. But that kind of, the form is also doing the work here. The form is alerting you to something, is I think a really useful space to kind of put next to historical writing, which works really differently, for better and for worse.
Yes, I just want to agree with everybody quickly here by saying, I teach the book in what should be should be a theory course, but ends up being philosophy. And the ways in which Saidiya writes a critique of law and ethics and history at the same time allows for that the students get a grasp of the historical itself behind the philosophical, right? Because if I were to teach the same thing with a philosophical text or an historical one like straight, it wouldn't happen, but it's in the writing, and they follow it so beautifully, right? Because they are affected by it. Mm-hmm. And then my work is like, okay, I don't need to say anything more about humanity now. You see the problem with the concept, etc. I just want to say that.
Sorry, I'm just going to quickly say, I had a professor in undergrad, and he would say, don't use an epigraph unless your intention is to meet or exceed the elegance of the text that you're using. He was like, don't bother, creative writer. He would also, I took a lot of creative writing classes, and you'd be reading your poem aloud, and he would say, cliche. As you're reading, he would say, if I've heard it before, it's a cliche. So you would say rain, cliche, water, cliche, honestly. So, I entered a space. So Scenes of Subjection was like the highest order of poetry for me, and I couldn't fail it by not meeting or attempting to meet the measure of the prose. So that is all I try to offer, to my students who are navigating very difficult territory and terrain. Like, let the writing do this work for you if it can. And if that can't be done in a disciplinary framework, then exceed that framework, because the work is more important, and that's why some texts are celebrated 25 years later, 50 years later, 100 years later, and some are just present.
No, I was going to say just very, very quickly in terms of the prose, something that I've talked about quite a bit, again, with my friends and colleagues is this process of there could be a long sentence, right? Maybe a paragraph, and then at the end of that paragraph, there's one sentence, it's short, it's to the point, and sometimes it is almost a distillation of what's being said in the previous sentence, and so that is something that I can't do it, right? Because my long sentences don't make that kind of sense in the way that they do within your writing. But I've also really have been drawn to those short sentences that are saying, like, this is also exactly, I want to be clear that you get that this is what I'm saying here. But if you're really reading, then go back and reread that longer sentence to unpack the different questions and possibilities coming from there. So I just think that that particular process is really informative for me as a reader.
You have to really yell.
So the question is about, for Denise de Silva, the temporality of slavery, and particularly with respect to the elements and poetics.
I use the elements as a way of, as I was trying to describe the movement that I find in Saidiya's thinking and writing, right? Because I said, okay, there is an analysis of the text that situates it in Black studies. That is what I do usually when I read scenes and other texts in an interrogation of philosophy. But I was like, what else? what is that transformation and how can one speak of both the work that is done in the text and the work that it allows us to do. So I did that reading using, a reading device that allowed me to re-describe, to say the same thing, but then now through the elements. And what's fundamental there is that it is transformation without time, right? Because the structure, the form itself allowed me to follow the fact of the text as one that transforms. So transformation without time, it transforms both then, that moment about which it's being written, but also now as we read the text and the fire cuts across, the linearity of time, basically. There is more to be said. I'm not going to say anything about the poet because the poet is really more complicated. I need to spend more time unpacking it because I wasn't expecting the poet come the way it came as that about which you should not. It's like, don't go there. But maybe one day I'll write about it. Thank you for the question.
I mean, the only thing I would say about that is that it's in some ways a panel on scenes and a panel on this moment in Saidiya Hartman's work is insufficient to answer this question because the evolution through Venus into Acts, Belly of the World, one of my personal favorites, and Wayward Lives, we see the origins of fabulation here, and then we see the emergence of ever unfolding and exploding questions of archive and poetic engagement. So I think that's sort of what I would say about what it means to look at a body of work.
But I just want to reiterate what I started out by saying, which is that the archive is a place of, it is a starting point. And the interdisciplinarity is what allows us to bring a range, a philosophical, a literary, a geographical. I mean, there are so many methods that the historian needs to draw on. But as I say to my students, you have to start in the archive and you have to sit with it because our lives are there. And to presume that there's nothing there is to relinquish way too much of our power and our presence to the structure. We all know the archive was built to exclude us, but it wasn't successful. So I just think that you have, as a historian, as someone who trains both history and American Studies graduate students, I always say you have to start in the archive, in the tedium of the archive, and sit there, and then your interdisciplinary strengths will help you to navigate it. Yeah.
I think that to turn to scenes and think about the archive, Jennifer, I'm so grateful to you for locating something that I think is might be called archival rigor, but I don't mean that in the gross way. I mean that in the sitting with the tedium endurance process way, and I think inaugurating or at least welcoming a process of deep reading, close reading of archival materials in order to excavate the lives of enslaved women, that's here. But also, I think that I was surprised actually that this didn't come up, but I think it makes sense. Now, I think that one of the things that I take for granted as having come out of scenes of subjection is a question of the ethics of looking, the ethics of our ways of knowing, and I think that sometimes ideas are so good and so clarifying that we forget that they had an author.
Right.
And I think that that kind of, I think of scenes often, and I offer it often to students as the place to look for that inaugural critique of modes of looking and of the spectacularization of violence, which then also shapes our ways of knowing and ways of looking when we are in the archive, and resistance to falling into that kind of the ways that the archives of slavery attempt to titillate. And so yeah, I think that it's an expression in a way of how very foundational that ethical stance and critique is in our field that we didn't even really have to talk about it, because it's so immersive in our ways of speaking about histories, and visual histories in particular, of slavery.
Yeah. I don't have anything to say too long, but I think for me what's profound about the text is it is a theory that respects history in the sense that it generates its terms from the archive rather than superimposing the terms of a contemporary moment onto history to try to make history make sense. It is literally using the words of like carnal knowledge and the particular language of the time to really get us to think about, as much as we possibly can, what did it mean to exist in that context? And I think that's really important, because oftentimes we approach these archives with an S, with a lot of our own desires. It's actually impossible to not approach it without your own desire. I mean, really, it's what drives you there. But the desire can be so heavy as to already predetermine what you are going to find. And I don't think that Hartman's text does that. It really just follows where these historical texts are taking you. And what I think is really moving about the use of the archives in scenes is that there's both the argument that's being woven through the chapters, but the footnotes are rich because there are so many directions that are present in there for you to go elsewhere. Yes. So when someone says, oh, well, chapter 3 doesn't deal with the male slave, I said, well, yeah, the hell it does. Because did you read? Did you really read? It's there. And I think that that is a way to do the work, and to do the work richly, and that richness is what has us sitting here today, I believe.
I think I was the one who said something about questions. So I'll start the answer, which I think actually is fairly simple, which is I think keeping them open. Like I experience them as quite open. And I think at some point I think I read scenes as an undergraduate and then went to graduate school and started doing my work and was assigned again and read and kind of thought, uh-oh, like that's already been done. Time to pick a new dissertation. But of course not, right? Like, I think that I just think the questions are still very much open and on the table, and actually part of what we're talking about here with the physical object and the sharing and the teaching is the recursive turn in this work that I think sometimes the impulse of like produce can sometimes obscure this other thing that is actually happening all the time, which is return. Like, there's quite a lot in a single book. It takes a long time to make a book, and there's a lot in it, and so then there are like the key thing that gets taken away. But when a book is really good, there's just so much there that the questions are still open, and there's so many of us who need to answer them. And I think actually that speaks similarly to physical archives, right? To like that there's we're not done looking. But anyway, so how do we close the question, I think, is actually we keep it open.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about the pathways that brought me and other folks of my generation into graduate school, which was often through the works of like Alice Walker, Audre Lorde, the publications around Kitchen Table Press, which I was reading as an undergraduate thinking about history and was sort of not always understanding that they were happening in a different discipline, right? So it circles back to a kind of thread of Black feminist writing and publishing and storytelling that I think undergirds so much of this work. And I, for one, am, as I'm sure everyone, very protective of my bookshelf. I also am astonished by Emily's generosity. And very protective of those texts that I acquired as an undergraduate, and that, and I'm so grateful for these moments when we get to look back and to recognize that our looking back to 25 years is also preceded by another, 10 or 15 years of reading and conversation. So I try to name those foundational thinkers in my work and in my conversation whenever possible, because I think we are at a kind of crucial moment of like a gathering, an accumulation that we need to be really protective of, and we can't take for granted.
Thank you all again for your generous conversation. We'd like to end with just us all thanking Saidiya for this phenomenal text. And